Hello, and welcome to the next episode of Show Me SaaS. Joined by the usual partners in crime here, Bill and Toby. You want to wave hi there?
Hello, everybody.
Hey,
Hello, there
everybody.
it is. Bill's got the cool guitar in the background still there, so I'm still looking. I do have a different background today, but it was not hip enough, so I blurred it out. So, but anyway, I really appreciate you joining the session today, and we're going to talk about something that is a topic that when I bring it up, I think sometimes has builders immediately sort of cringing and asking, like, why that? Why do you want to talk about that? And there's this notion of cost per tenant. And the basic idea of cost per tenant is how do we somehow correlate a tenant's consumption of our system or our resources in our system with the cost that they're imposing on my system, the infrastructure costs of my system. And that sounds like something like an accountant is supposed to be interested in, that somebody who bills people or keeps track of revenue is supposed to know all that. And it's true that they're probably interested in that number, but to me, this number, even if nobody else in the organization cared about this number, as an architect and as a builder of a SaaS solution, I still very much would want to have access to this information. I need some notion of how changes I make in my architecture, how the design of my system, how the way that tenants are consuming my system are really affecting the cost footprint of my solution. Because as an architect, to me, like that's part of my job as a SaaS architect, is not just to have a really cool system and a really cool architecture. It's one that sort of optimizes for cost as well, and really reflects the sort of the cost profile of the organization. And so I guess for me, I wonder, and I know, Bill, this is an area you've poked at a fair amount as well. Mm-hmm. Do you see builders in the wild sort of embracing the notion of cost per tenant, or is this still one of those ones where we're sort of on the leading edge of an idea that is still needs more attention?
I think it's a combination of both, as is everything, right, Todd? I mean, for some people who are greenfield to SaaS, this can seem like a low priority, right? We need to focus on growth. We don't need to worry about how much things cost. We just need to get customers onto it. We'll worry about being profitable later. And you certainly hear that in the startup sector. And on the other hand, I've got a really interesting call later today, talking to an enterprise customer who's trying to figure out how to SaaSify one of their applications. And they really have a very strong motivation to understand exactly how much it costs to operate one of their tenants. And they really want to make sure that this is profitable. It's part of a greater suite of applications that they want to SaaSify and go to a product-led strategy growth. So they want to make sure they really nail the cost per tenant right out of the gate. So we see this all across the board with different messages from different customers. So I think as it depends. As all of our answers do, it depends on the customer and where they are in their journey.
Maybe that should be the title of our show, SaaS. It depends.
It depends.
Exactly. Yeah, it is a tough sort of area, and we had that metrics discussion that we had in an earlier episode where it had a similar theme to it, right? Which is, are you investing in getting the important metrics here? And maybe it's just the soapbox I like to stand on, but I just think, gosh, if you build this multi-tenant environment, customers are coming and going all the time. How they're consuming the system is changing all the time. I've worked on a system where, an e-commerce system where, like, before we had this data, we had no idea that, like, our basic tier tenants, our entry point, low value sort of tenants, not low value, but at least low revenue sort of tenants, our low margin tenants, were like doing crazy things with our system that were imposing all kinds of cost on our infrastructure cost of our solution. And meanwhile, we had like these premium tier folks who were in these really common streams, and they actually didn't do some of the crazy things that the basic tier tenants were, but they were our main profit sort of center for the business. And so for me, without some visibility, like soon as I had visibility into those kind of metrics and I could lay it in front of the business and the other people on the team, everybody's like, wow, we have to start thinking about this now when we put new features and new functions into our product, and like ask that question. But I guess maybe I'll move to the more obvious point of this, which is, because you could say I could calculate costs. Like, there's ways to calculate costs. I could just tag all my infrastructure inside of AWS, for example, and get to understand what costs. Why, and Toby, I'm going to put you on the spot here. You know, you would love it when I do this.
I do.
Why do you think multi-tenant makes cost calculation harder? Like, what's different about it? What curveball is it throwing us?
Well, I think, you know, they're varying kind of, it's a spectrum possibly, but, you know, on one end, if you've got everybody say lumped into the same infrastructure, the same database, let's say, and the same compute and everything else, and you've got 1,000 tenants in there, you know, how do you divide it up? And to your point earlier about the company that had, you know, a free tier, let's say, gobbling up the lion's share of resources, how do you even know that that's happening if you don't have some visibility into how you apportion it across the spectrum of tenants? And I think that, you know, that's the biggest thing. I think it becomes a harder problem if you're dealing with pooled infrastructure, right? If everybody is lumped into the same kind of stuff. If what you're doing is offering, say, and again, this isn't anything that a tenant should even know about, but if you're offering a silo of infrastructure to a tenant for those reasons, maybe it's less of a problem because it's easy to say, because then you could just tag it, right? But you can't just tag a database. And, you know, the granularity it's too coarse grained. So
yeah, I think that's to me the nuance of this. That is the hard part of this, which is to say, our goal with SaaS in a lot of cases, not every case, we've talked about silo versus pool, but a lot of SaaS businesses are like, we want the pooled infrastructure because that's a big part of our economies of scale, right? The more we can share infrastructure, the more then that infrastructure scales based on real consumption activity of tenants. But the downside of that is now I've got resources that when these resources are shared, I don't have necessarily visibility in any way to decide how much of the consumption of that resource belongs or is attributed to any one tenant. And that's where most people run into this problem. In fact, let me just add something here. Just a really simple example of this in a slide, right? Like if you think about, like I've just got here an example of, hey, I've got this, I happen to use Amazon ECS container as my compute here. It could have been any compute in reality. Probably should have just labeled that compute. And then I've got some managed storage service that's part of my application. So pretty classic sort of application notion here. Well, on the left-hand side, I do have units of cost, which are, I can tell you how much ECS cost me. I can tell you how much I'm paying for that RDS instance and the storage that goes with it. But that doesn't tell me what the footprint and the allocation of individual tenants are across that experience, right? So I've got 3 tenants is what that's supposed to represent there. And the compute, for example, I don't, you know, without some kind of instrumentation or some kind of extra gathering of data, I wouldn't be able to tell you, did tenant 1 consume 30% of it, or did tenant 2 consume 70% of that resource? And so for me, the right-hand side is where is the notion of consumption unit. So within a resource, how can I tell you how much each individual tenant is consuming? And to me, that's the hardest part of this problem.
So with this slide, you're just trying to basically point out how there are 2 distinct, like it's like getting the stuff in the right side of this slide. I guess what you just said, that's the tough thing, right? So how do we, if we've got 3 tenants all commingled on the same ECS cluster or whatever, what is it that you're using to kind of split that up? And you know, are there metrics available that you can use as a tenant perspective or from a tenant perspective? That's really the heart of this problem.
Right, exactly the heart of the problem. Well, and then another dimension that I try to include here is I agree with what you said. That is the heart of the problem. But the problem even gets more interesting as we move to other, like compute's the easy one to say that
Sure.
for.
Yeah, but like
now,
say
RDS,
network,
I've got
or
cost
whatever
associated with the compute dimension of that storage service, and I've got cost associated with the storage dimension of that service. And I might have to like allocate those separately as well, because I could have something that's not consuming a ton of the compute, but is consuming a ton of the storage. So I may have to get more granular in that respect. So it gets more dicey as you go to these other services.
and I don't want to preempt this if we're going to talk about this later, but what is the answer for this? If you have, let's say, a black box resource that just costs, whatever it costs, and maybe that cost keeps going up monthly, at what, like, if you can't slice it, I guess that's there's no one size fits all and your mileage is going to vary, but what would be our advice to a customer to just slice it up per tenant? So if you got 1,000 tenants, divide it by 1,000, that cost?
Yeah, you're getting into kind of what I don't care. We can address this in any sequence here since you've asked the question here. For me, and I don't know, maybe Bill, you have a different perspective on this, but for me, I'm going to find I'm going to invest in finding these consumption metrics where there's the most opportunity and value for me to get them, right? So if to me you said, these 3 tenants all consume the ECS exactly the same way, and my bill wouldn't change a ton. So knowing how it's split and doing all the work to figuring out how it's split isn't a lot of value to me. Or another dimension of this might be, got all this data in S3, but S3 represents 2% of all my infrastructure bill. Am I going to get a lot of value out of going and spending all the hard work to figure out how that 2% divides across all my tenants? Probably not. So there's some intersection between the parts of your system where that knowledge will be super valuable and the effort you want to invest in doing it, and the other parts of the system where you'd say it's just not worth it. Just do some generalization of the cost there and say that's good enough.
And this probably dovetails into the metrics / monitoring, kind of the observability of it, right? Like if you had application level metrics that were saying, for what it was irrespective of compute or database, but you knew that tenant 1 had a million API calls, whereas tenant 2 and 3 didn't have that between the two of them, then that might influence some of the way you do these consumption units as well.
Right. Yeah. And I think this gets like, for me, it's always easy to draw one diagram and say, okay, solve for that. But the sort of landscape of services that could be running your multi-tenant infrastructure here, like OpenSearch or Redshift or MongoDB or Kafka or whatever, like the range of different services and different tools that you might be applying in your infrastructure, they might all require different approaches to figuring out what's the right way to measure consumption and attribute consumption for that particular service. So that, to me, that's a super hard part of this. Totally. And I don't know, maybe do you, like, for me, I don't have the magic bullet there, right? For me, it's a one-off. Do either one of you have like would you just sort of approach these in isolation, or do you think there's some higher level way to approach this that is like, oh, if you generalize to X or Y, you can at least have some strategy that would cover all of them?
Go ahead, Bill.
Yeah, I'll take a stab at it, because the answer is going to be it depends, of course. So we already know.
Of course.
But I mean, honestly, it depends what your objective is, right? So I'm working with a customer who is doing internal SaaS right now. So essentially, they're running a SaaS platform on behalf of internal business units. So they think in terms of chargebacks. So they want to understand exactly how much all of their infrastructure costs so that they can properly apportion that out to each business unit. And the business units actually care. They have visibility into this. They want to understand how every part of the system, more or less, is costing, so that they can turn around and optimize their own practices and everything else. So they're spending a fair amount of time going through and trying to figure out how to at least approximate tenant cost for each piece of their architecture. And some are, like, as you said, some are harder than others. It's very easy to do something like a container, perhaps, if they're not shared, but databases can be challenging. If they're using a data lake, how do you break down a data lake, right? There's all of these different challenges they're running into, but for them, it's worth it. If I was talking to a different customer, and Todd, I think at some point, I mean, you might even have a slide around this, if I remember, there's different strategies you can use and say simply, hey, I just want to proxy this. I don't want to be going into every single service. So I think those two strategies, I want to understand what you're trying to get to. Is it simply a high level understanding of what it costs to operate my tenants so that I understand that my pricing isn't completely out of whack with my costs? Or is it, I actually have to do a chargeback to my tenants, so I need to understand to the penny exactly how much each of these tenants costs to operate? And those are two very different scenarios with very different technical implementations.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I have always, and every time I've talked about this topic, I have tried to say to everybody, you are not building a billing system, an accounting system. You are building something that is getting an analytic that gives you a view, and good enough here is something you should be looking for, right? Like what's the, because this is never going to be an exact science of like this, absolutely, this tenant one consumed 12.7675% of my resources. No, it's like, if I get within a few percentage points, I'd be lucky, right? I'm just trying to get a decent approximation of that. And so, yeah, you mentioned I might have a slide around this, Bill, and I will confess that this was my attempt in a talk I did a while ago to try to say, well, where are some of the like natural points that you might instrument an application to collect this data, and what are some of those patterns? And I would admit there's probably way more than this, but these feel like good high level parts of the discussion. One is what I would call a global entry point, which is essentially you're saying, I'm going to go to the outer edge of my application, the API entry point maybe of all my backend services, and I'm going to capture whatever sort of activity is going on at that level, and I'll just use whatever that activity is to sort of approximate consumption by tenant and project that across the entire system. I won't even care about whether it's S3 or DynamoDB or what's going on under the hood of it. Certainly lower effort, but not as good of accuracy as you can imagine in that model. The next one I proposed, and this really that microservice maybe overload, whatever the services are of your application, I could say, well, I can get more granular than that. And I could look at the front door to each service at least and say, who's consuming what services and what level of activity is attributed to these individual services. And that might give me a more detailed view of what's going on, still moderate effort and somewhat better accuracy. It's debatable, but probably a little better accuracy, or at least a little better visibility than you get with the global model. And then the third one is sort of to me, the ultimate sort of where, if you're really after the deepest view, and again, you can do this selectively, is what I was calling resource level sort of profiling, where I'm actually going to look at the database or the queue or whatever that individual resource you're in, and I'm going to attribute consumption at that level. And I know I'm doing most of the talking here. Apologize, just because I've got two slides here. And if you just sort of visualize what that looks like, I've got a sample web app here on the left, and you can see at the top, I've got an API gateway, and there I've just got some Lambda authorizer that is grabbing and inspecting activity and publishing something to my metrics and analytics environment. Now I've got some REST entry point to my microservice. I'm instrumenting it there. And then down here, there's some point at which my microservice is consuming some resource. And now I'm instrumenting at that level. And I thought this was at least a useful way to say there are layers to this model, and you may opt into different layers based on the different needs of your sort of cost profiling exercise. These aren't necessarily mutually exclusive of one another. But I guess maybe the question I'd pose back, and just because I love to put Toby on the spot today, imagine you just did the Lambda authorizer model, right? So your API gateway is all you've got, and you're just whatever data I can infer from API calls. Do you think you could get something useful out of that?
Yeah, so assuming that you had some tenant attribution at the API gateway, yeah, I mean, it would be the box on the left of that first slide, right? It would be, you've got some cost, and hopefully your costs kind of scale with usage. In that, 1,000 API calls would cost you $100, and 10,000 would cost you whatever a multiple of that is. And if you can slice that up amongst your at a very, again, coarse grained resolution, right? A very low resolution kind of way. If you could slice it up amongst your tenants to say, this tenant is using this many API calls, which all things being equal should equate to whatever that percentage is. I think you could get, again, a very coarse grained, low resolution view of it. Again, hoping that the that your costs, I think you said this before, are lower than what you're billing, right? Like that would make sure that those lines never cross.
Cool. And Bill, how about you? Does the layer model of this, because we haven't really ever talked about this in much detail, does it resonate with you, or do you think there's a better way to think about it?
It does. And honestly, if I'm talking to a customer for the first time about cost per tenant, and the answer I'm hearing from them is, well, we don't really know, then especially if they have any sort of pooled architecture at all, even if there's some version of shared within their architecture, is sitting on an API gateway, whether it's our API gateway or whether they're using Kong, whatever else they're using, even if you're using Kafka or some other messaging system, if there's a single choke point where you can say, I can sit on this stream of traffic right here and approximate how much information is flowing through my system, I can probably take that same data and correlate it to cost. I can say every time someone, break it down into CRUD, right? Because an API gateway is generally going to understand your HTTP verbs. So if I get a GET request in, that's going to return approximately 10 meg of data every time. And if I get a put request in, it's this. If I get a post request, it's this. And you could break that down as far as you want to. You can go API by API, or you can just say at a very high level, hey, every time a tenant requests data, it's going to be about this. You can get surprisingly accurate approximations just doing that. So if I'm talking to a customer for the first time, I'm starting there and saying, hey, this is table stakes. You've got to at least have some approximation of how much it costs. And then to do that, you still have to go into your resource levels manually and say, okay, all right, when I do this operation, it's going to cost about this much, and do some work. Like there's going to be some lift to do that. But from a technical perspective, especially if you've got a legacy application, it's the least invasive way to do it, right? I can go into my API gateway, and if I'm already getting tenancy from a JOT token, for example, I basically have this in place. I'm pretty much turned on logging, and all of a sudden I've got my metrics at least going into my into CloudWatch, and I can extract them there, perhaps with CloudWatch Insights or something else. That's almost free from a technical perspective and doesn't require any retrofitting of your application at all. So if I'm talking to customers and they haven't done this exercise yet, start there. If they're in, and then go down the stack from there, right? If you have the ability to instrument your applications or create sidecars or get deeper into your applications, you can get a much, much finer grain detail. And then if you can sit on every call to every database, or if you can actually sit on the different resources, you can get even more granular. But I don't want you to, I think, Todd, you kind of alluded to this before. I'm not looking for them to, stop and rethink their entire application and redesign everything. I want them to get to this data as quickly as possible, because if they don't have it today, you're losing information. Right? I mean, right? Yeah. Sorry,
and to some extent, you'd hope that if in the case of a legacy application or whatever, right? You'd hope that they had gone through this exercise at least a handful of times just to understand how to price it, right? Like,
you'd hope.
Like, how do you even know how to charge for it?
Right.
Yeah, you'd hope is right.
Yeah, unfortunately, yeah. I mean, you would think they would, and if we're working with them, we absolutely do go through that exercise. Some customers, they had an application and they SaaSified it, quote unquote, and they said, hey, this is how much we charged before. This is how much our customers are willing to pay, and they just drop that price on it without even understanding whether they can cut a profit on it or not, which is crazy, but it happens, right? I mean, people make these jumps because they feel like they have to without all the information at hand.
That's more common than not to me, unfortunately, right? Which is somebody will sometimes come up with a pricing and monetization model that is more driven by what, and I know you got to factor in what customers will pay,
right?
But they don't do the extra work on the back of half of that to say, yeah, but how does that correlate to the actual bottom line sort of cost of our infrastructure, at least, so we can say that's a good model or not, right? Now, for some places, that margin is so big that they're like, it doesn't matter. But to me, I don't understand. I guess I don't relate to that, because no matter what product I sell, even if it's not software, like margin matters to me. And if I can eke margin out more, right? If you said, hey, by building my architecture differently and knowing better how tenants are consuming resources, I could get another 3% out of my margin. I kind of want to get another 3% out of margin is the way I look at
Well,
it.
and especially if you had it, I worked for a company that we went to the cloud, right? There was an edict by the owner to say, hey, we're going to go to the cloud. And really what that meant for him was taking everything out of a colo that we rented in Denver or whatever and moving it to AWS. And it was exact same, right? It was a bunch of big EC2 instances and a bunch of giant SQL servers. And it's like, I think our costs went up as a result of that. And so, but we were in the cloud. And so from that perspective, there probably is a point at which if you get enough subscriptions, your profits outweigh your costs, but but that's, not the situation you want to be in.
Yeah. And I think the part of this one that I struggle with is part of me is like, well, some people just don't have anything. So if you at least go and instrument at the outer edge of your app and you do the global sort of entry point kind of way of approximating cost, even if that's not wildly accurate, you're at least starting to create some momentum around the idea that we need that data and the insights. But I also know that, like, you could say, hey, that approximation that happens at that level, it may be way off, because you could have a request, something that's chatty, for example, at the API level, but doesn't end up correlating to a lot of consumption on the back end, and somebody else is invoking some other workflow that like pushes some huge analytics part of your system and consumed a ton of resources on the back end, or fired off some batch job, right? And you're like, okay, the front end now isn't such an awesome measure of that. Now I got to start either looking at those API calls to say they have different attributions, or I got to drill deeper. But at least it gets you started somewhere. And to me, that's half the battle, I guess. So let's shift maybe the discussion a little bit here now to say, great, there are different areas at which we should instrument. But the next sort of layer of this discussion is, what are the reasonable ways you should measure? Like, what is it? Like, to me, is it the frequency of time somebody calls something? Like, what's sort of the universe of things I ought to be thinking about when deciding which metric or which measure is a good approximation of the consumption of a given resource? And it's a wide open question, but I guess for me, it's like, these are some ones I came up, right? Later, the common times, like how many times something's asked to be done, how much, what's the latency, or how long did that take? Those are pretty straightforward, but they may not be good, again, approximations. Then you could actually look at how is the resource itself being pushed. Like, I could go to compute and say, like, what a level of compute consumption, CPU consumption happened here, what level of memory consumption happened, and say, that's where you're really going to drive costs, because that drove scale and made me spin up more instances. This is where, to me, is the more nuanced part of this sort of build, right? Because if you just say, we just want to know tenant one did X and we'll just use that to count things and we're done, that's great. But to me, the real cool part of this, and where it gets really interesting, is like, what should I measure? And should I measure something differently for one part of my system than another part of my system? I'm curious, Bill, maybe, like, do you just say measure whatever? Like, is it sort of it depends sort of scenario all over again? And
isn't it always?
Depends guy?
It totally depends.
Yeah, it always depends. But I would say that the depends is heavily qualified in this case, right? If I'm looking at a system, the first thing I'm going to ask is, well, all right, so if you went into a hospital and you had 4 injuries, like, the first thing they're going to try to figure out is what hurts the most, right? What's the thing that they need to triage first? So if I'm looking at an architecture, it's the same story. What's going to kill you first? And if it's GPU costs, like, let's say you're running GPU based instances and it costs 10 times what your other EC2 costs are, well, let's focus in on what's causing those to get triggered. If you're using a heavy streaming based solution, and maybe you're using EventBridge, for example, and that's a little bit expensive, I'd want to understand what's causing that EventBridge cost, and can we correlate that to a tenant? So maybe, I mean, just in terms of strategy, less in terms of what exactly you measure. I'm looking for what's driving most of my costs, and can I get to a direct correlation to the tenants with that? Because sometimes I think as you peel that onion, you'll reach a layer where you're content, right? So it would just be like, well, I've peeled back 2 layers. I've got my storage and I've got my What's driving my CPU costs? Maybe that's enough now. I've figured out enough to basically get to a very close level of tenant costs. I can ignore some other stuff, where I could just divide some other stuff up based on that ratio that I've already generated, right? So I've said, okay, I figured out how many requests are coming in and why they're driving GPU costs. Well, I'm just going to take that same ratio and apply it to storage or something else,
right,
and find that, that's enough to get to.
So maybe the bigger question is, and I think this starts to relate to the broader metrics discussion. You're probably just not going to get this right at first, is my assumption. You are like, let's guess and say it's X or it's Y. I guess what do you do to sort of start to narrow in on what the right thing is to do here, right? So do you just need a rich metrics and analytics sort of pulse of the system to be able to say, oh, right now we're measuring execution time, and that's not the right thing for this resource. So now that we see it, and we will evolve what we measure here. Is that a good way to approach it?
I think there's another depends there. Do you have data or not, too? Because we sometimes talk
data, then
right?
You're just gonna
then you're guessing.
Here's my bill. Here's what we're measuring. Let's try something else. Right.
And we did that exercise with a customer recently. They have metrics, but they hadn't really broken them down in any way. So the first thing we did was take a look at their AWS bill, which is broken down by services, and then start to look at going to the what hurts. What's costing you the most on your AWS bill now? How do we go to your metrics and figure out how to divide up those costs? So it's sort of working backwards from the data at hand.
Right.
Now, if
do you have the right pricing strategy, right? Like if you have an application or an offering that has a bunch of different features, let's say, that some of which are basically free to you, some of which might be really expensive to you, are you charging for them? Or is it all lumped in the same kind of subscription, right? So understanding the dimensions of those features and how they impact your bottom line could also, be a strategy.
I think that's a key point that I really hadn't included in this discussion, but is one that is super important. And I think we talked to customers about it, but I didn't really make it a top level concept here, which is this data won't just necessarily tell me how I should price my product. It might tell me how I should tier my product as well, right? Which might be, oh, wow, customers really consume this resource and it's really expensive to consume this resource. This is a point of inflection in my architecture where I may offer a siloed bit of infrastructure for somebody who's in a higher tier tenant, and they'll be willing to pay for a better experience there, right? So the data, I guess my point is the data here could drive your tiering strategy as much as your pricing strategy. And maybe that's the same thing, I guess, tiering and pricing. But to me, I think of we talk about whether a resource is silo or pooled or not. And if I had this data and I was making choices around this, and it's like, man, I'm making a choice that I could see this is a really good experience for the customer, but it's going to add a lot of expense to an environment. I'm going to use that as a tiering moment as well to say they're going to pay a higher price to get access to it.
Yeah, I think there's an interesting point that I spent some time talking to customers about, which is cost and pricing are two different topics, but they're heavily interrelated. And you can't really do one without the other. I don't want them to be thinking about pricing when they start thinking about collecting their cost data, because I want them to understand they need to do that regardless. You have to gather your cost per tenant data regardless of whether it affects your pricing or not. If you can charge $1 million per tenant and you don't have to worry about cost, I still want you to go and understand your cost because of a lot of the reasons we've already talked about: optimization, fair pricing, all of those things that go into the experience of your tenant and for you operating the SaaS solution. But eventually, once you get that cost per tenant data, it will give you the ability to impact your pricing downstream and to intelligently price your product and even create new tiers you hadn't considered to be possible, or what Toby was just suggesting, going with a feature-driven approach where you do a product-led growth and you'd say you buy a very simple product out of the gate and then you add these features on and pay for them separately, which all are great strategies. But unless you understand your cost, how are you going to understand how to price any of that?
Well, I'm curious what you think about the notion of, I often will advocate for the notion of what I call a composite sort of metric here, which is like maybe in your environment, the measure of the consumption of a resource isn't just one sort of very directly mapped concept that maps to infrastructure concepts like requests and CPU consumption. Maybe it's an amalgam of those things, right? Which is to say, it's kind of like building, to me, almost like building a scaling policy. When you're building a scaling policy for scaling out compute or whatever it is, sometimes that scaling policy is driven by a combination of factors that decide I need to spin up more instances or so on. Do you guys think composite is like meaningful here? And do you think that maybe even be more common than just these baseline items, or is it just all over the map?
Bill, I'll let you go because I don't know that I completely understood the question.
Oh, come on. No, if you don't get it, then somebody else probably didn't get it. So imagine, Toby, that I would decide that request count plus CPU time is some measure of some new metric I define that has got some way that I apportion those two things together and arrive at a new metric based on that. And now I'm going to drive I'm going to measure an allocation as a customer across the combination of those two things. So I'll get the raw data, but I'll make a composite metric out of that based on some formula I have, and I'll allocate based on that.
No, I think yeah. And maybe for me, that was an implicit thing. I didn't think that it was ever going to be, each of them fair. Measured independently. But I always kind of figured it would be some combination of that you arrive at, in, again, however you do the math, probably taking the whole picture into consideration.
Let me add some context to something I worked on there too, where there's actually maybe more than one process to this operation, right? There's the process of collecting your metrics, which could be completely independent, right? There's no need to aggregate at runtime as a request comes in. Maybe we're using a tracing tool, so we could correlate the the number of calls into it to the CPU usage. But in reality, more often than not, there's going to be a separate process that's going through all of your metrics and aggregating them and creating these combinations. So having those two separate processes lets you sort of, have some flexibility built into the system where you're just emitting all of the metrics, fairly statically out of your system. There's not a lot of intelligence built into that. It's just, okay, I got a request. I'm going to send off a metric for that request. But where it gets really interesting is how you aggregate those, and you can do all sorts of math after the fact, and you can say, well, today I want to take a look at what my CPU cost plus storage cost is. Tomorrow, maybe I want to look at the CPU cost plus the number of messages it spawned, or something like that. And having that as a sort of multi-part system where you're emitting all of the metrics, and then you have a flexible system after the fact, just like an analytic system, right? That says, I can take everything I've emitted and I can slice and dice those in any number of ways. And that can, again, leads us back to the pricing conversation. Once I can sort of recombine those metrics and say, hey, I've got a dimension that looks like this now. Is that something we could price on? And that also feeds into, if you think about like Marketplace or any other billing system, now you can create those dimensions as your billing metrics as well. And now you've looped in 3 different conversations, which hopefully doesn't confuse everyone. But, cost in these dimensions leads to pricing in these dimensions, leads to billing in these dimensions, and setting those up with your billing provider. So it's very important to have a good idea of what those metrics should be. And I think if you ultimately look at some of the billing that some of the more sophisticated SaaS providers use, they've come up with even a single metric that represents many different billing dimensions. Like, for example, a snowflake unit. What is that? I don't know if anybody knows, but they're going to charge you a unit every time you consume so much of something. And that something is going to be probably a combination of storage and CPU and number of calls and number of users. But they're the ones who determine that, right? They're the ones who say, this is the combination of things that I consider to be a billing unit. And somewhere behind the scenes, they're instrumenting their code to emit all those pieces, and then have some form of a calculation system behind the scenes that's combining those things and say, okay, I think Bill has used up a unit. We're going to charge him another unit because he used more CPU than he was allotted, or he made more requests than he was allotted, or whatever that trigger is.
And you could even see that in AWS, right? A lot of our services behind the scenes, I don't know this for a fact, but I suspect that a lot of them are just kind of aggregates of other services, right? Like code pipelines, probably backed by S3 or code build, or what's the source control one, code commit, right? Like, so there's just a lot of times they're just combining, just like a customer would, combining different services to offer a new service, and it's the same type thing. They'd have to price it accordingly.
Yeah, I would, for me, like if I thought, like if I were doing this myself, what would be the logical thing to do without overcomplicating it? It's like, well, first of all, there's some likely business notion of what our app does, and some notion of the kind of, we know kind of the areas of resource consumption that are an abstraction of the infrastructure that probably are natural things to create a composite of to do that. But I'd also say that you also know the workflows and the use cases of your system where cost ends up being a big factor. It's usually, we know like, oh, we've got this big like analytics heavy part of our system, and every time somebody does that, it really imposes a heavy load on the system, or this big batch thing they're running, or whatever it is they're doing. You know kind of where those sweet spots are, and you probably have some notion of like how to aggregate some notion of what consumption looks like there, right? And I honestly feel like that's where a lot of this discussion really happens. It's and yes, the raw data is useful, but I think turning the raw data into something that means something in the context of your business is really like where I try to steer people towards. Now, I guess for me, the other thing I think about is like, what's the job look like for somebody to build this? And I never think this is a very exotic part of the discussion. Because to me, I'm like, okay, we've agreed, we understand these metrics, we're going to do it. Like, what does that really mean to me as a builder of a system? Like, what am I supposed to do to make this work? And the truth is, there's probably hundreds of solutions to this. But for me, it's always boiled down to like any other sort of instrumented experience. You have to capture an event, and you have to publish an event, and you have to publish that event with enough context that you can infer whatever you're trying to infer from that event. So in this particular example, I had a microservice, some Lambda layer, as sort of looking at the event of what happened, building some sort of JSON message, and then sending that along to my metrics and analytics service, whatever that is, right? That could be an aggregator, it could be a data warehouse, it could be whatever it is. And ultimately, I think the question for me here, where this always gets interesting, is we talked about all these different kinds of things to measure. Is it one JSON object that is one schema for all? And I guess JSON and schema don't go in the same sentence, but one structure that is the same for everybody, or no, like I'm going to have a bunch of one-off variations of this. I don't know. For me, I don't think there's a blanket answer to this. I think this is just all implementation. It's just like, what kind of event do you want to have? Because I think the desire to like generalize this to some big framework seems odd to me. I think that you really are, there are probably themes of tools and frameworks you would use here. And I could point you at like 6 different AWS patterns for ingesting events and doing them things. But fundamentally, it just comes down to what's in this event and how is it conveying meaning to your environment. That's how I look at it. I don't know if you guys have sort of a contradictory point of view or an and to that. I don't know. Is it that simple?
I think this goes to what Bill was saying, right? Like do you do any intelligence at the point at which you're collecting it to make that a smarter kind of metric that's getting dumped into it? Or do you just dump everything into something and then do the intelligence afterwards? But yeah, I'll let Bill comment. I feel like it's there's no good answer here. It depends.
Yeah, always. I think, Todd, you've created the necessary pieces here, which are almost always about the same. Like you have to be able to correlate this to the tenant, and you have to be able to correlate this to an ID eventually. We haven't really talked about how you get to the cost of a resource, but at the end of the day, you're going to have to correlate this to the cost of a resource, and you have to know when that execution happened, right? So whatever tool you use at the end of the day. So, I mean, again, just getting a little soapboxy here, but if I said, I want to collect this data. And even if I don't have a costing system today, but I'm going to start collecting this data and just throw it into a bucket somewhere. I'm just going to throw it into an S3 bucket. I'm going to throw it to CloudWatch somewhere where I'm going to get to it later. As long as I have these pieces of data, I can always go back and figure out, okay, you know, based on my billing reports, this execution cost this much at this time. You know, this is, again, it's kind of independent of the process of figuring out the cost. This is much more about basically collecting metrics. And if you can do this and successfully gather at least these pieces of data, then you've got a great head start on everything else.
Yeah, and I'm just maybe layering on what you've said already, which is, to me, it's always a two-phase process, which is give me the raw metric, and then let me build the algorithms, decide what that metric means to allocation, and what units I might make as a composite unit and so on out of that, and keep that separation. And like you said, now if I always have the raw metric there laying there, if I change my algorithm for due allocation, I can be learning that. Some people would talked about machine learning in this space and saying, hey, I'm going to actually figure out what the right things I should be measuring. And like, if they get enough of this data, they'll actually do some sort of ML based approach to figuring out what their model ought to be or what their consumption looks like. I have never sort of taken it that far, but where I have struggled with this sometimes is, obviously, if I'm just measuring some event happened and how long it took, then that's good. But when you start getting into some of the other kind of consumption events, they don't always have a start and end time, or they don't always have like, well, how do I go measure storage of like a file like that is just out there? How much S3 storage am I consuming? Well, that's not going to be an event. That's going to be some other thing that is like a job or something I run once in a while that goes out and collects that data and generates some event for it. And that might look a little different. So I feel like it's easy to do this when you take like latency or one of these other sort of simple metrics. But I do feel like there's a fair amount of nuance in coming up with the structures that make sense here. Yeah.
And you're right to call that out, Todd, that there's going to be, there's two different models that you've already sort of called out. There's compute and there's real-time things you can do. But there's other things like storage. Maybe you measure them once a day. Maybe you measure them once an hour. Whatever that is, you need some process that probably doesn't exist today to go and take a look at your disk and say, well, you use this much of it, and you know, how are we tracking that, and how are you breaking that down, right? And that could be a scheduled basis. It could be looking at your logs. It's a number of ways to do that, but it is different than these real-time, you know, just track it as you go type metrics that we could be firing off.
So here's the other question, and this, I think this is one that is more like, what's the spectrum of possibilities here kind of answer, which is, what do I do to make this easier for builders? Because we always talk about, how do I make it so that the author of that microservice isn't got like 30 lines of code in every single, like laced, repeated all over their microservice to try to like publish this event? Are there things I can do with different technology stacks, with containers or with serverless or something that could say, hey, if you take this particular approach, you can get some of this data at least without a lot of heavy lifting on behalf of the developer? Are there anything, Toby, I'm going to put you on the spot here, any sort of mechanisms or tooling across the different technology stacks that you might think would be good to look at here as a way to offload some of the burden here?
I mean, for me, this feels a lot like, you know, kind of going back to our did we talk about metrics and monitoring in this?
A little bit.
Me SaaS? Yeah, but going back to that, right? Anytime you could offload that to an aspect or to a library or to a sidecar or whatever else, and leave it such that it's just a natural part of doing what you normally do without having to kind of pay special attention to that, I would be an advocate for that. You know, sidecars and Istio, like service meshes and those kind of things, having the Envoy proxy there that can, for all intents and purposes, record basically everything that's flowing in and out of the container with greater or lesser degrees of information inside there would be probably a good candidate for recording some of the stuff and stashing it off. I know that out of the box with Kiali and some of the other tools inside Istio is specifically, you've got good visualizations of that. You could see where traffic's flowing and where it's stopping and what the latency of that is. And that might all be at the infrastructure level and maybe not so much at the application level, but maybe a good place to start.
Yeah, I think for me, it's just like anything where I have observability, I still put this in some layer of observability, which is even if it's not for operational metrics, it's for another view. It's still like, can I surround my code with something or some kind of technology construct that will intercept and automatically recognize some activity is underway and just emit the data that's needed, and I don't have to play a role in that, right? It's like kind of like CloudWatch, right? Like CloudWatch is just getting me data. I didn't do anything to tell it how to get it. Our agents are used often, like by just different partner solutions, right? To go get data from the JVM or the CLR or something else to just automatically tell me what's going on. I would like this cost per tenant thing to say, at least for as much of the system as you can do it, try to leverage like sidecars or like serverless has extensions that are use aspects maybe or something of that nature to say, I'm going to at least push this data out to the edges of my microservices or my system in some way, in a way that it just works. And then I'll still have to add more in, but if I could out of the box just get lots of that data with very little work, and every microservice developer just got it every single time they wrote a new microservice, that would be a huge win for me. But that's just good design. There's nothing earth-shattering about that, as much as I guess I'm encouraging you to look for those things, because the scary thing would be for me to tell everybody to go get cost per tenant and then go look at a system and see, oh my God, to get cost per tenant, they just like overloaded all their existing application code with all this instrumentation that has made it like made their microservices less manageable, maintainable, and so on. So maybe that's a bit of a soapbox moment there.
And
Go
Todd,
ahead.
I'll just add on to that and cheat if you can. And in all aspects of building SaaS, if you can find a solution that exists for this already in the wild, like KubeCost or like Cloud Zero partner solutions. And I know we were going to talk a little bit later about, maybe some third-party solutions, but honestly, this is the space where I think about this. You're thinking, how can I do this without interfering with my existing system? And KubeCost has a free version that's a lot like a sidecar that pushes metrics off into Prometheus in your containers, or sorry, in your cluster. So if you could do something like that, or if you can have Cloud Zero sit on your namespaces and simply instrument those for you, absolutely do that, right? Like,
no, it's an awesome call out, which is to say, like, obviously to me, if you said tomorrow there was something that was an off-the-shelf solution that did like 90% of what you wanted, by all means, you don't like, this is heavy lifting you don't want to be spending a lot of time on. So the degree to which you can lean on partner solutions here, so far, I would say that there are people starting to close those gaps, but a lot of them still rely on some front end sort of instrumentation and even if you had those tools, somewhere in those tools, you'd still have to say, yeah, but what are we going to measure and where's that data need to come from, right? But I would like to think in the longer term here that this will become less of an issue, right? Like, and I would like to think that infrastructure providers will have some notion of tenancy someday, where they would just be able to tell us, what those costs look like. Now, I did as part of that discussion, sort of maybe this is the part that always gets left out of the discussion, and I didn't want to make this whole discussion about this. But where this really gets interesting is we talked all about how to get this data on the left-hand side. Like, what should you do? What data should you get? But ultimately, you come down and you've got some allocations and you know how tenants are consuming your different resources. You still don't know cost per tenant. Somewhere out there, you've got to go get the cost data from whatever environment you're running in. And you've got to correlate this data to that cost data. And that seems like, oh, that's just a read some file and apply some math and I'm done. In reality, that can be a heavier lift than getting the data about consumption. So for me, like, this is an absolute area where you're going to want to rely on third parties, right? Like, you do not want to be out there writing your own billing aggregation sort of system and correlation system. So like Bill was mentioning, Cloud Zero, and I know we have the application cost profiler that's part of AWS that will do this correlation for you. When you start this process, like, don't forget this piece of the puzzle. It's an essential part of the puzzle, and a part that people overlook a lot, I think. And I know, Bill, you've got some passion around like getting that right as well, right?
Yeah.
Anything to add
Yeah,
there?
absolutely. I mean, at the end of the day, all of this work you do, if you're going to have to tie that to your cost and usage report or whatever you're getting from your infrastructure provider, right? So there's somewhere they're going to have a list and say, this is what you charged you for executing this particular resource. And cloud provider is going to give you a very granular view of those executions. They're going to be able to say exactly this cost exactly this much. And if you've captured your data, if you're getting down to a resource level, you can correlate those two things, but it's a challenging exercise and it's undifferentiated heavy lifting. So again, this is where there's KubeCost, Cloud Zero. There's others in this space, in the third-party space. I wish I was up to date on all of them, but those are two that I know really well. And then application cost profiler. And all of them essentially are going to do the same thing for this part of the exercise, which is you're going to tell them, hey, I executed this. And they're going to look at your cost and usage report and say, well, that cost that much. I'm going to correlate and create those totals for you for your tenancy. They operate in different ways. There's certainly advantages and disadvantages to each solution. And you're going to want to think about what you want to do with that cost information, how you want to slice it up, and look at what those third-party providers or application cost profiler can give you out of the box. And assuming that you can feed them with the right data, because like you said, Todd, none of them are automagic yet. You still have to feed them something, or you have to hook them into your system in some way. Assuming you can feed them the right information, they can do all this for you and give you nice dashboards and make the experience a lot more tenable and understandable than you could do yourself.
For sure. And I will say, just because I know we skipped over this, we show you arriving at this allocation, by the way. And this is a little bit out of order, but I wanted to make sure we made this point, which was, you have, as part of doing this, you also have to make the decision, am I trying to get to one allocation for my entire tenants? Like, tenant one across all my infrastructure consumed 19% of my, or 15% of my infrastructure. Or are you doing this in a more granular way? Am I say my storage cost allocations per tenant were this or whatever, and my compute were X and whatever across, and you instead break it down by the individual sort of blocks of infrastructure that are the logical bits of your system, or you could have both of those things. And my point is that there is this is where the math and the algorithms of how do you want to get from these finer grained units of consumption to some rolled up approximation of tenant consumption. And there's a lot of thought that goes into that in this process. And this is where, again, accuracy could become a big part of the discussion. But I just wanted to be sure we sort of added that to the discussion, but maybe we'll just step back here before we wrap up and say, like, where's the best place to start, right? We hinted at this already a little bit, but if you're going away from this and you have nothing today, like what would we tell somebody to do? Anybody, either one of you want to jump into that?
I'll let Bill go. I think he kind of already touched on that.
Yeah, no, I think we've all sort of hinted around this, that find that single point that can give you the best, I call it proxy. I think approximation, whatever you want to think about there, the thing that gives you the most information, the biggest bang for your buck, and then also take that burden off your developers if you can, right? Don't put it on them to actually have to go and instrument their code and figure out how to do this. Instead, find something that lives outside of your application code, like an API gateway, like a Kafka stream, something that will help you to open things up and say, listen, I can look at this and get an approximation to how much tenant usage is. And I can take that and do some tablecloth math on this and say every request is approximately this much. I can take my AWS or my cloud bill and say, well, if I match these two things up, I'm pretty close this month. So this is what we're going to use for now. Something like that is very doable. It takes the burden off of your application developers to have to go and retrofit their system, and then move on to the next step, and then poke your application developers and start to get them involved.
Yeah, for me, it's literally find the sweet spot of value for cost in your system. You know where those are typically, and at least do something there. And you might not be right for a while, but do something there. And then the more you do that, the more you will say, hey, maybe there's another layer of value and I can go out from there and I'll expand my reach somehow. But what you don't want to do is try to build some massive framework and try to instrument everything from day one. I wouldn't suggest that for anybody. And anybody who's even done this whole path, I guarantee you there's parts of the system for which they have no instrumentation because it's just not valuable to them. So, you know, and I think that's sort of probably an obvious path, but one I like to usually, a point I like to make for anybody who's heading down this path. So anyway, I know we're at time here. I hope this was valuable for people. I really am trying to help you build a mental model for what it is to think about how to approach this. And really then it gets back to your own solution, your own technologies, and figuring out how to map these ideas to those technologies. But again, hope this was a useful episode. Really, Bill, Toby, thanks so much for being part of this. And we'll look forward to the next episode. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks
Bye.
all.